Okay, everybody, welcome to ARCI's virtual forum number 22. Beautiful day here in Northern Illinois. I think the wind chill is about 10 degrees, so it's a great day to be inside talking about my favorite hobby here. Got some great presentations today. I'd like to thank all the people attending today live and especially people from other clubs. And you can see that we've got a full schedule of dates for next year in 2023 up there. And if you've got any feedback, send it to us at that email address right there. And I'd like you also to consider being a presenter. A lot of people in the past year presented that never presented before. And we've helped them put together those slideshows, so you can do it. And if you're in the live audience here, you can do it. If you're watching this on YouTube, send us an email at that address right there and let us know what you think and what you'd like to present on. The protocol is pretty simple. It's basically stay on mute unless you have a question. The chat window is a very useful thing to ask some questions or put some information. And at the end of the meeting, remember to save that chat file with all that information in it. And just a reminder that we are going to record this and put it on YouTube. And you can see today's agenda there. We've got a great agenda planned. And before we get going on that, we'll have Matt talk for a few minutes. But after the presentation section, we'll do brief show and tells. I know we'll have a few of those people out there doing short show and tells. And Tom Kleinschmidt will talk about the swap meet and some other relevant club information after that. And then we do an items wanted, items for sale, and items wanted includes information, it includes equipment, whatever you are looking for out there. And then at the end, we'll have an open session. So after this introduction, we typically go right to Matt, who gives us a brief talk about what it means to be on YouTube. Matt?
Okay, so first off, my apologies to the regulars. You've heard this before. To the newcomers, as Tom mentioned, we do record and edit these virtual forums for later sharing on YouTube. So be careful that anything you say or show will be available to everyone on the internet. So you might not want to share directions to your house or your home phone number. As Tom mentioned, a good place for that is the chat. And we've already put some items out there. In addition to what was just mentioned, I just posted the invitation for our next session in the chat. And I also included the invitation for tomorrow's Mid-Atlantic Antique Radio Club's meeting. Our own Robert Lozier will be doing a presentation there on the Delco farm radios, which I think is interesting. Other considerations, follow Tom's lead. He keeps us on schedule, and most of the time he'll open the floor up for questions, time permitting. Otherwise, please stay on mute. And last but not least, stay off the music stations. YouTube has a feature where it listens for copyrighted music, and it will give a copyright strike and take down our video if copyrighted music is detected. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Tom, and we can continue.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. So we've got three great presentations lined up today. Interestingly enough, two of the three are from the Colorado Club, and the first, Neil Gallensky, has not presented yet to this forum, but he will be doing a talk on the Navajo Code Talkers. I've seen some of the physical presentations that he's put together at some of the Colorado Club shows when I was a member out there, and they're always fantastic. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. And first, I'd like to start just by briefly introducing myself. I'm Neil Gallensky. This is my partner in crime and life, Allison. We've been to a number of Radio Fest events, and that's our connection with your club as well as with the Colorado Radio Collectors here. And I thought this would be a good topic for this time of year because we've just commemorated the remembrance of Veterans Day, the service that a lot of great people have provided to our country. Also close to Thanksgiving, so it's really expressing our gratitude to those who have served. So I'll go ahead at this point and begin my presentation. And Allison, who's a master Zoom presenter, is helping me a little bit with the slides this morning. So hopefully now you can all see the presentation. A little bit of introduction before I begin in detail. Why did I become interested in Navajo Code Talkers? A few years ago, I attended a local radio swap meet, a ham fest, as the amateur radio operators among us would call them, and saw a very cool little portable radio, military radio. I didn't recognize it. I looked at it. I ended up negotiating with a vendor and buying it. And as I left the ham fest, he said, you know, this is a radio that was used by the Code Talkers. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I remember seeing a movie about them. It led me on an amazing journey of discovery of history, connection of radio and military service and innovation in a time of need. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Allison, why don't you go ahead and move on to the next slide and we'll begin. So who are the Code Talkers? Code Talkers were people that could speak in a plain language, not in English, and could carry on covert communications in the open. So you could say things that hopefully nobody else could understand. It could be encoded either in voice or in Morse code. If the messages were intercepted, the goal is nobody else would understand them. And the vision is that you could talk plainly in real time without having to use a code book or some other technology and get the message across fast without the enemy or the adversary having any clue what you're talking about. So why were Code Talkers needed? There are a number of challenges with military communication. You need to get things done quickly. You need to get the message across completely accurately, no ambiguities. You need to keep the information from getting into the wrong hands. And anybody who's ever served in the field would know that conditions are often adverse. You're under fire, the weather can be bad, equipment can fail, lots of things can go wrong. However, that in some cases increases the urgency of getting the message across. So the solution was, rather than relying on code books and machines and wheels cranking and gears turning, to be able to talk, to get the message across immediately and clearly without the risk of somebody else breaking into your communication channel. And the challenge is, how do you do that? So some very bright people have been considering these questions for a long time and came up with some absolutely amazing breakthrough ideas. Our adversaries were quite adept at decrypting secret messages, at mathematical computations, developing codes. I'm sure many of you have heard the history of how we broke the Enigma code or the Japanese purple codes during World War II. Our adversaries were trying to do the same thing to us, and they were quite effective at it. They had access to tools and resources and people that allowed them to do these kinds of things, often very quickly, often quite effectively. So we needed a new approach, a way to encode messages that didn't just depend on formulas and on computing and on those kinds of things. So the concept of code talking, as I already mentioned briefly, came to the rescue in this case. And Native Americans were recruited even in as early as World War I as communications resources that could speak languages that weren't spoken in other parts of the world. The indigenous languages of North America are a language family that's pretty well isolated from other language families of the world, the Indo-European or the Asiatic languages. And that gave us several advantages, that you wouldn't have native speakers abroad who could intercept your messages. And often there weren't even written forms of these languages. They were oral traditions. and therefore there weren't any dictionaries around. And an enemy agent couldn't just patch into a telephone or a radio conversation and pick up on what was going on very quickly. So during World War I, the adventure of code talking really began in the United States military. The Choctaw Nation provided individuals who communicated over battlefield telephone lines. They were very effective at getting messages across in the trenches in Europe. The messages were never intercepted and decoded. However, that having been said, there were risks. Germany, for instance, had a lot of residents in the U.S. who were academics, professors, educators, who could research language, who could potentially co-opt a member of one of the community of native speakers of these languages. And the risk was if they did that, they could start to build up a dictionary or a key to the language. So there needed to be more done beyond what we had done in World War I. So as we entered World War II, Philip Johnston, who's pictured here, as a young man, grew up on a Navajo reservation. His parents were missionaries, and Philip Johnston had a great idea. He thought, well, the Navajo language really is unique. There are almost no other languages on the planet directly related to Navajo. I guess some languages in northern Alaska have some resemblance, but even they are quite different. When World War II began in the Pacific and with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, Johnston said, hey, I've got an idea. I grew up with Navajo children. I speak a little bit of the language. If we can figure out how to leverage that language in the U.S. military, maybe we have a tool to make this amazing code that had never been developed before. He ultimately convinced the military to give it a try. So let's take a bit of context on the Navajo Nation. My wife, Allison, sitting with me here, makes maps for a living, and it's wonderful to have a professional map-making resource at my disposal in this case. So looking at the high Colorado Plateau in the Four Corners area of Colorado, as we're looking here, it's a very broad area. We're looking on the left at the Rio Grande River that flows down through Santa Fe and Albuquerque. The Continental Divide is just to the west of that. And then you have the high plateau, which is where the Colorado River carves canyons. A very stark, a very open, a very desolate environment to some, an environment where if you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to survive candidly. The Navajo had been here for thousands of years. There are 4 mountains identified in this picture. They're in different colors of black, white, blue, and yellow. These were the mountains that were sacred to the Navajo and defined the boundaries of their homelands. So originally their homelands would have been bigger than the Navajo Nation that's represented in the darker brown in this picture. That's the current so-called reservation that the Navajo inhabit today. But this is a land extremely remote and extremely isolated, where these people had lived for thousands of years and became one with this land. And this really helped to define who they were, helped to define their identity. Let's talk a bit about what it was like for the Navajo during the 1940s living in this land. There was a great push going on by the American government to westernize or assimilate offensive words such as civilize the Native Americans at that point. And the young people were taken from their parents and they were conscripted into living in these Indian schools, boarding schools. You can see a photo here of just such a school from the 1930s or 40s. In these schools, the attempt was to get the young people to give up their former identity, their former culture, their clothing, their ceremonies, their language, their religion, everything, and to become westernized, to become civilized. They actually had a very rich culture, a very strong identity, something that was part of their core being, and they attempted, without being seen, to observe that what they felt was important to themselves, including their language. You didn't want to get caught speaking Navajo in one of these schools, or you'd get your mouth washed out with soap, or even worse. And many of these young men were able to remember and to preserve their traditions. And as you'll discover very soon, thankfully, they retained their language skills because it became oh so important to America during World War II. So 30 members of the Navajo Nation were recruited by Philip Johnston in conjunction with the United States military. And they were put aside in a small group, given a building and some resources, and asked to develop a military code using the Navajo language. Their code needed to be so secure that even a native speaker of the Navajo language, one who didn't understand this coding process, wouldn't be able to understand the message. Of those 30 people, 29 completed the initial program. The additional one, for personal reasons, left that program. He did serve honorably in the US military, but 29 people did complete this program. So the technique that was used was to take common military terms and turn them into objects in the Navajo world. So airplanes became birds, ship became fish or whales, a squad of men became a flock of sheep, and then they developed a phonetic code for terms that might not be sensible in the Navajo language. So I don't speak Navajo, I can't pronounce it well. Just as an example, the letter E became elk in English, which became Dze in Navajo, which is the word for elk. So if you were spelling out a word, you'd get all kinds of word phonetic terms that people would just say, why are you saying elk, sheep, mountain? That means nothing to me. And as a result, there were multiple levels of encryption built into this real-time code. So this code within a code was so bizarre and so arcane to anybody else in the real world, they wouldn't get anything out of it. A final key point is the code had to be committed to memory. No dictionaries were ever going to be carried into battle because that would defeat the whole purpose of making this a spoken code. So here is an actual copy of a cover of one of the dictionaries that was used to train the Navajo code talkers. And as you look at this, there's a bunch of imagery that could be considered very offensive or very stereotypical. However, there's a lot of humor and a lot of irony built into this message. So we have two members of the United States Marine Corps pictured here, an Anglo person on the left, a Native American on the right. The person on the left just seems to be attempting to send smoke signals. The person on the right has their foot on a radio, which is going to be a little bit difficult to see. However, that's going to become important. It's got the initials TBY on it. We're going to be talking about the TBY radio in a minute. And it's interesting that the Navajo here is using the superior communication method and the superior technology. The jarhead on the left maybe doesn't quite understand it yet. However, they're going to learn to understand it. So a lot of humor and irony built into this message. So this is taken straight from CIA's website on the internet. And here's some brief examples of the codes that were put together. So you've got all kinds of objects important to the military on the left, specifically aircraft in this case. You've got the Navajo word that became encoded as, and then you've got the English explanation of what those Navajo words were. So you notice a plane became an air force, a force of air. A fighter plane was a hummingbird. A transport was an eagle. So all kinds of metaphorical encoding going on here. Similarly for ships, again, from the CIA's website, which is a good resource to understand how innovative and how important this method of encoding was. You can see that ships, a battleship became a whale, a cruiser became a small whale, a mosquito boat is one exception. It became a mosquito rather than a sea creature. But it, again, a likeness or a metaphor is a way of encoding things. So let's talk a bit about the deployment of the Navajo code. The first 29 trained code talkers are shown here in this picture as they were preparing to deploy out of San Diego to ship out into the Pacific. They were not talked about publicly as code talkers. They were the Indian platoon of the United States Marine Corps, the 382nd. Nobody was to know what these guys' job were outside of the people who were going to rely on them in the Pacific. And by the end of World War II, nearly 400 Navajo code talkers had been trained once this program's value had been determined in the actual field. And during the island hopping campaign for us to take the Pacific and ultimately to confront Japan, the code talkers were involved in almost every major battle that you would have heard of during World War II. I've got a few examples listed here. So let's talk a bit about the Navajo code talkers and their training. They completed the entire United States Marine Corps training regimen. They were fully proficient and qualified in combat and survival skills. As a matter of fact, the first code talkers, realistically, as they were placed into combat units, their commanders really didn't understand what they were capable of. And they said, "You know how to shoot a rifle?" And the young man would say, "Yes, sir." And they would order them to go out and take up arms and join the front lines. Later on, as their value was discovered, obviously their specialty became more and more valued once their commanding officers knew what was going on. So code talkers were in incredibly high demand once their capabilities were discovered and once they were determined to be effective. I've got a picture here on the right. This is from the U.S. National Archives. These were staged photos. However, they were staged to show what really did go on. The code talkers typically worked in teams of two, where one was writing down the message on a Marine Corps message form. The other was handling the radio. These guys had to adapt quickly to beachhead and tropical jungle deployments. These guys came from the desert, so quite an adjustment for these young men, highly effective at it. And their main job was relaying coded messages from the front lines to command and vice versa, often reporting the positions of artillery, talking about opportunities to advance, understanding what the enemy was up to, and so forth. These guys came under direct enemy fire. They were not protected. These guys were in the heart of combat. 10 of them gave their lives while serving their country. Obviously, they were protected as important military resources as they should have been. However, they weren't safe. They were in the midst of all this firefighting that was going on. So let's talk about one of the most famous battles of World War II, Battle of Iwo Jima. This is a rock that's about 8 square miles, the size of Manhattan. Maybe a more relevant metaphor for you guys would be about 5 or 6 times the size of the Chicago Loop, 8 square miles. The entirety of the city of Chicago is over 200 square miles, a tiny little rock in the middle of a very vast ocean. Incredibly important rock. It had airstrips on it, and these airstrips were 750 miles from Tokyo, so within bomber range of Tokyo. So we desperately needed this island, and we needed to get the Japanese off this island. The Battle of Iwo Jima occurred early in 1945 when the Marine Corps invaded the beachheads of this island and attempted to capture Iwo Jima. And so the Japanese were well entrenched on this rocky volcanic rock. And an exact quote is the US forces attack was described as throwing human flesh against reinforced concrete. The Japanese forces were ordered to fight to the death. There really was no way to retreat. I mean, this island's surrounded by hundreds of miles of ocean, surrounded by the Marines. The level of casualties on this rock were absolutely appalling. I've got the numbers here. 1 out of 3 of the US Marines that landed was either killed or wounded. Of the Japanese, virtually all dead, just a handful taken prisoner, and some went into hiding in the tunnels and the entrenchments in this rock, never to be found. The code talkers participated in this invasion. More than 800 coded messages in the first 2 days of the battle by 6 code talkers working around the clock. 4 of the code talkers were killed just because there were bullets and artillery shells everywhere. And probably one of the most telling statements of the entire war, Major Howard Connor, who was the 5th Marine Division signal officer, said, quote, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Bottom photo is the iconic scene of Mount Suribachi down on the south end of that island with the US flag raising going on after the US had declared victory on Iwo Jima. So we're a radio club. As I say, I found a radio back when I was learning about the code talkers. Let's talk a bit about equipment that would have been available to these guys in the 1940s. Back then, radios were big and heavy. There were reasons military radios were often called boat anchors. Vacuum tubes, metal chassis, large antennas, generators, batteries, no transistors, no lightweight stuff. This was a lot of iron, a lot of big components. Miniaturization really wasn't a thing yet in radio. You needed your antennas up high and in the clear to really get a signal across. And that wasn't necessarily a good idea in some of these island battle campaigns. You were going to get shot at. The beachhead and jungle terrain and the volcanic islands, you've got magnetic rocks, you've got trees everywhere, you've got swamps everywhere, all kinds of things that make radio communication very difficult. And the Japanese were well entrenched, which means you were in danger if you were in the middle of trying to set up a complex radio system. So there was a great necessity to improve and make portable our radio equipment. And as you'll see in the next couple slides, we began to achieve some miracles compared to the technology prior to this. Okay, so we're going to try to pick up the pace. Before World War II, radios really weren't all that great for portable stuff. This was an artillery set, the SCR-194 BC-222, a super regenerative receiver, sometimes called a rush box, lots of static, lots of noise, not all that sensitive, needed a big antenna, really a 3-tube little radio, didn't work so well in the South Pacific, so it was superseded in a big hurry. So let's show some of the radios that did supersede it. The US Navy had some radios that really were designed to be deployed quickly to small ships, to shore parties. The TBX was one of the first radios used in by the code talkers. It still weighed about 80 pounds with its batteries and with its antennas. It took 2 men to set up. These were used by code talkers, although they quickly migrated away from these once they found lighter solutions. The TBY, this is the picture that was on the cover of that magazine, or the code talker dictionary. Nice and lightweight, a little pack set. It's about 10 by 10 by 10 inches. Little battery sits on the bottom. A man could carry this on his back. Not an ideal solution, yet a whole lot better than anything we have seen so far. VHF, very high frequency, amplitude modulation, and Morse code. One of the favorites of the code talkers, quick to set up, and it worked pretty darn well. By the end of World War II, the US Signal Corps had developed some pack sets that were superior to these others. Frequency modulation-based set, the SCR-300 BC-1000. This radio went on to be used for a lot of years, up to even the Korean War. It was used by a lot of our allies around the world, and this was a high-performance radio. This became really the standard for mobile communication, the so-called walkie-talkie that people used for a lot of years. Finally, one last radio. Sometimes this is referred to as the spam can radio. This is actually my father in this picture in Batesfield, Alabama. He was not a code talker, but he was a radio man in the Army Air Corps. He was training with one of these radios, and I just happened to find this picture in his collection of photos from World War II and thought I would use it. The main advantage of this radio, simple to use, self-contained, battery-powered. Disadvantages, vacuum tubes batteries don't last so long, very limited range. Think of the little walkie-talkies you had as a kid. That's about how well these would have worked. So the Navajo code talkers, out on their own, very isolated, away from their families, away from the desert region they grew up in. How did they stay connected with themselves? How did they perform in this incredibly challenging role, disturbing role? And many of them took a pinch of sand or some traditional elements from their native land. They carried it with them to help them to stay centered, to stay balanced, to stay focused, while they were clearly out of their element and in a very dangerous situation. And this really helped them to remain grounded, to remember what was important about the land they were defending, about their people, and about the United States while they were thousands of miles away. They'd often put a little bit of corn pollen in this pouch, and the corn was synonymous to the Navajo with the earth, the forces that nurtured them and made them strong. They would put a little pinch of this corn pollen on their tongue maybe before they were exchanging important messages to help them to remain out of harm's way and to help them to be effective at communicating. So this Navajo code was never broken during World War II. The Japanese did capture a Navajo US serviceman who was not a code talker, and under duress, or probably more accurately as torture, he was pressed to break the code. And he told his captors what was being said in Navajo, but he said, this is all gibberish. They're talking about elk and sheep and mountains. There's nothing meaningful in this. I don't understand what the heck they're talking about. So the Japanese gained no useful information. So think about this for a minute. A generation went by until 1968 before the code was declassified. This was because maybe this code would be needed in additional military conflicts. Turns out that technology, real-time voice encryption, became more accessible to the field by then, so they really didn't need the Navajo code anymore, and they were able to declassify the code. All the code talkers were strictly obligated under severe military penalty never to talk with anybody, including their families, about the code. The net result is these code talkers were never honored during this period for their contributions beyond what the honors that would be provided, the medals that would have been given to a low-ranking rifleman in the U.S. Marine Corps in the important battles of World War II. So really nothing beyond that. So finally, in year 2001, so another generation has gone by. 2 generations have gone by now. Congressional gold medals were awarded to the original 29 Navajo code talkers. Unfortunately, only 5 of these men remained alive at that point. 4 of them went to Washington, D.C. and were presented their medals by President George W. Bush. Silver congressional medals were also presented to the additional roughly 400 Navajo code talkers who served, although in reality, a lot of these medals went to their families because they were also deceased. So in 2008, an additional few years had to go by before the Code Talker Recognition Act was enacted by Congress, and medals were given to all the members of all the tribes from both World War I and World War II, posthumously in most cases again. So here's a picture from 2008 at the Department of Interior headquarters, Washington, D.C. 4 of the Navajo Code Talkers in their traditional post-World War II colors. These were their so-called uniforms they wore to help educate people about the service that they had provided. Ken Salazar, Secretary of the Department of Interior in the center here. Ironically, Department of Interior is also the department that hosts the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who managed the reservations. So I'm sure this was a very bittersweet homecoming to these men. However, they received the honor that they greatly deserved many, many years after it should have been provided. So probably one of the most famous of the original 29 code talkers is Chester Nez. A lot of pictures here ranging from standing with his family to his enlistment photo, to the cover of a book he helped to author, to his being presented with his medal by President George W. Bush, to some pictures as a very old man. He is now sadly no longer with us. However, a shining figure for communicating the story of the code talkers to many people. Finally, in 2007, at Quantico, Virginia Marine Headquarters, Network Operations and Security Command, there was a ceremony performed where a building was dedicated to the code talkers, and you can see somewhere around 8 of the original code talkers were able to attend that dedication in 2007. So worth emphasizing that Indigenous people, First Nations, as they're called in Canada, Native Americans, as they're often referred to in the US, many, many tribes did code talking during World War I and World War II, some in Europe, some in Asia. A number of the tribes are listed here. You can see a reference to the website that has more information if you wish to go out and research this further. So in summary, code talkers were one of the most important factors in the United States being victorious in the Pacific Theater. A code that was never broken. It worked under extreme battle conditions. Sometimes the simple but innovative approach is the one that wins the day. This code was kept secret for so long that really the men who deserved our respect and our honor weren't around to receive it in many cases. Finally, more of us are aware of their heroism and their innovation, and our gratitude continues to go out to them. And finally, these stories serve as inspiration to Native Americans and especially to their children on how service was provided to their country and on how they helped in a great time of need to keep America safe and to help us to win the war. And keeping these stories alive is so incredibly important. And if any of you want to go on a journey to understand more, we'll put some resources, some books I would recommend you're taking a look at from your library or your local bookseller in the chat, and you can go out and investigate further. That's basically it for me today. Wanted to thank you all for listening, and hopefully this was as inspirational for you as it was for me when I began to learn about the code talkers.
And just a quick comment, where both of us are sort of at the end of the baby boom. Both of our fathers served in World War II in the Pacific. Neither of them had any idea about the code talkers. Even though Neil's father worked on radio, my father wasn't technical, so he wouldn't have known. But it was kept very secret. And the other comment is that the Secretary of the Department of Interior, the lead of that agency now, Deb Holland, is Native American, the first Native American to lead that organization. And I'm putting
Well, that's awesome. Neil and Allison, that was a awesome presentation. I learned so much. The detail that you went through to put that presentation together is very commendable, and I was extremely impressed. So thank you very much, both of you, for putting that together, and Neil for the great presentation.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a quick question. Who designed and made the radio they ultimately used the most, that little portable job?
Okay, the little portable job, it was a United States Signal Corps project. Motorola actually trademarked the term walkie-talkie, and I'm pretty sure that Motorola was in the lead on the SCR 1000, as well as the handy talkie on the spam can radio as well. So Motorola did a whole lot of the work. Some of the earlier radios, the Navy radios, they had their own organization, the naval communication folks, and they often worked with Emerson was involved in the TBY radio, and I can't remember some of the others. There were, as was typical of the military, they had multiple sources to build the things once they were proven in and designed. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, the TBY was the one I didn't think of the name of it. Yeah, but
okay. Yeah, the one I have, I believe, has Emerson on it, although there are 3 or 4 other manufacturers as well.
But real quick, my ancestral family business is Kleinschmidt teleprinters, and the government owned the design by contract, and so there's a lot of Kleinschmidt gear that says Kleinschmidt on it, and there's a lot of it that says National Cash Register and a bunch of other people on it because they went out for bid. So the same thing happened with radios as well.
Very good point.
I have a question. Were the code talkers protected from being killed to the best of the Army's ability?
The answer is yes, they were protected. They actually, especially once their value was discovered, they tried to keep them off the very front of the front lines. However, there are only so many places you can hide when you're in Guadalcanal or when you're on Iwo Jima or when you're on Saipan. So there's only so much that could be done. And 10 out of the 400 were killed, which means the survival rate was actually pretty good for troops on those islands, especially the Marine Corps, who generally was the first in on almost all those battles. So yes, they were an extremely valued and extremely protected resource.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks again, Neil and Allison, for that awesome presentation, and we look forward to your next presentation. That's something. Next, we have a presentation called Plant A and Other Puzzles from Tom Kleinschmidt, and Tom is our club president. So I'll turn it right over to Tom.
All right. I've kind of gotten infatuated with house brand radios, and part of it, of course, is people keep asking what Plant A means. And if you go on the internet, you'll see all kinds of debate about it. But there's actually hard documentation that'll tell us what it is. But I'm going to make you stick till the end to find out. So in the interest of time, some of the stuff I'm going to go through fairly quickly. There is a companion article to this that'll be in the club newsletter coming out shortly, so you can get the same information. Once Matt posts it, you'll have it from 2 places, and also in the chat, I put in some links and some books that are key to this whole process. So here we go. As we all know, you can easily find commercial makes and model stuff. You know, whether you want to use the internet, whether you want to use books. The issue comes down to what happens when that doesn't work. So we're dealing with orphan brand names or brand names that were really obscure even when they were new. And then we're trying to find out who they are so we can dig down into the history. And as I'll point out, in the case of 2 radios that are going to be in examples, in both cases, Tom Zaczek and another fellow who contacted the club were looking for servicing information. So what we're going to do is first talk about kind of the the ecosystem, I'll call it, the manufacturers, brands, and retailers, and then a few ways to determine the manufacturer. And I will give you a whole list of sources. Then I'll get you into Plan A, and and we'll slow it down a little bit once we get into those details. So here we go. This is stuff you're all familiar with, but I just want to set the stage. You've got mainstream companies that sold through all kinds of retail channels, whether that be Atwater, Philco, Zenith, ARCI, all those brands, and all that documentation is very thorough and very easy to get to. You also have companies that sold a brand name but didn't use their company name. So Motorola originally was Galvin Manufacturing, later on became Motorola Inc. But in this time period in the 30s, it was Galvin Manufacturing. And Capart originally was an independent company, but then Farnsworth bought them, and that was a brand name under Farnsworth. So those are kind of what you would find in department stores, radio stores, all kinds of places. And that's the easy stuff. But then you get into this brand management world, and that would be where a retailer would have a captive house brand. And I think you're familiar with all of these on this list: Allied Radio with Knight and Romer, Montgomery Ward with Airlines, Sears with Silvertone, and so on. But they went out for bid and had various people build their radios. There is a couple of lists of Sears radios that just go on forever as to who they contracted with. Ward's during the 30s was primarily Wells Gardner and Belmont, but that doesn't mean there weren't others. And everything I've got in here is reference to where it came from. So if I'm making something up, I'll let you know, but it's all pretty much backed up by facts. So the other thing you get into is you got people that did private label as well as their own brands. So in the case of Belmont and Colonial, they sold under that company name and the brand name, but they also sold under Airline and Silvertone. And then big guys like Philco and Zenith made car radios. And the car radios were not branded Philco and Zenith in the commercial world, although they may say Philco or Zenith on the radio, but it also would have the car brand on it. It would say Chevrolet, or it would say Nash, or it would say Packard, or something like that. And so every possible mutation of business arrangement you can think of, just as you see it today, existed back then. So with that out of the way, one other little anomaly. Sears bought Colonial Radio, and here it says before 43, and I think it was in 29. I've got sources that aren't absolute, and part of that further research was somewhere in the middle 30s, Colonial stopped selling radios under the Colonial brand because they were captive under Sears. But Sears kept buying radios from other places. So you have kind of a web of information there. So here's the first case study, Compliments of Tom Zaczek. This is a Fidelitone radio. And as we know, whenever you go to swap meets, you find all these brands you've never heard of, but they kind of look familiar, but then again, they kind of don't. So here's what we're doing on the detective side, is collecting the data. So the only place it says Fidelitone is on the front here. We know the tube lineup because the tube sockets are marked. And there's a model number, which is 210. And there's a serial number. Now, normally you'd ignore the serial number, but this C prefix turns out to be the secret sauce. And we'll get to that in a minute. So Tom found this thing called on grillcloth.com, and I can't give you the direct link because it doesn't work. So you have to go grillcloth.com and then click Radio Finder. And they have you put in 4 of the tubes of any given radio. And then it does a search and comes up with a list. And in this list, the tube lineup matches here and the model number matches here. And it looks like it was made by Corona Radio and Television. But in reality, that's not an absolute for sure. That's just a really good start because other people could have used the same sets of information and Corona may or may not have been the guys. So it's not that Corona. And it's not that Corona. But here we go. So Tom jumped onto radiomuseum.org and they had a Model 100 radio, which the dial was identical to the Fidelitone. So that's another clue. This is a picture of Tom's chassis here. And then the other one is Girardi's Radio Troubleshooter's Handbook. This thing is just a goldmine of information. I didn't even know it was there. This book has been on my shelf for 40 years. And in the back of it, they have a list of manufacturers and brand names. Who knew? So looking under Fidelitone, this says on the license tag, it would say WM and Company. Ours doesn't say that. And it would say WG24 if it was Wells Gardner, doesn't say that. But if you look up Corona, it says early, usually with a C preceding the serial number. Now the Corona got bought and sold and their manufacturer's mark changed with time. But these are the guys. And I'll show you why in a second, because there's a schematic. So if you go into Riders and look up Fidelitone, you get nothing. There is no Fidelitone, but there is a Corona 210. And there's a schematic, and Tom tells me that schematic's a dead match. And so we know with all that data that that's the radio company. So you may have said to yourself, I've heard of Fidelitone. Well, they made phono cartridges. That's what you have seen them doing. And the interesting thing is they're still in business today as a logistics company. And of course, logistics has nothing to do with manufacturing or anything else, but their money was made with Fidelitone cartridges. Their money was not made in radios, and they outsourced their radios. They were just branding a radio and testing the water. Probably had some success, but obviously not a mainstream situation. So then we go on to the next one. Here's case study 2. We had a member of the public contact us that said, I have this club radio. What can you tell me about it? Basically, this is his email. He sent me some pictures, and then we went back and forth, and he sent me some other pictures, and this was an easy one. Here's the license and patent tag, and it says WG24 right here in the corner. That's Wells Gardner. Nobody knows what 24 necessarily means, and I'm using that word in quotes, but whenever I see a patent and license label, whether it's in print, whether it's on a radio, it always says WG24 in the corner. So for all we know, that's a document number. So here's the radio. So again, doing the detective work beyond knowing that it's Wells Gardner, we got to figure out which Wells Gardner it is. So it's a 0 to 100 dial. So by that, we know it's a TRF set. By the lineup, we kind of know it's a TRF set because it's got a zillion 26s. There's a 24 in this can, which is the detector. Some more 26s because somebody's brother-in-law sold 26s. And then there's a couple of 45s and an 80. It also has this green mark, which I will tell you I didn't notice when I first saw this picture. But once you dig into the data, you find out that green mark's important too. Here is Riders. And all I did was open the rider manual. Turns out the first listed schematic in Riders number 1 is this radio. There's the tube lineup that matches. There's 2 versions of it here, which we'll get to in a second. And it's either called a Model C or a Model CG under Wells Gardner verbiage. But there's more. So the second page, they talk about these color codes, yellow, red, and green. Turns out that was a cumulative set of revisions because apparently they couldn't get the phono hookup right. The one that this person has is actually the last version with the green mark. So then that rivet color would have been red, yellow, or green, and for whatever reason, the paint held up really well. Then on the back, it actually says the Club Aluminum Company. So now we can find out something about the company that sold it. And Club Aluminum made pots and pans. So they were dabbling in radio, trying to figure out if that was going to be their next big deal. And they are owned by the Miro Company today, and the Miro Company's been bought and sold a bunch of times. But in any case, they sold stuff basically on the Tupperware party plan back in the day. And when the Depression hit, people weren't buying and they went bankrupt. So the brand still exists in some obscure way, but the company is long gone. So then there's other radios that use the same chassis. Gilbranson's a company that made player pianos and home organs. They called it a 9-in-line radio, cleverly enough, because there's 9 tubes in a row. And then they had a whole series of model numbers they sold it under. Same thing is true under Wholesale Radio Service, which is the predecessor name to Lafayette. Lafayette was a brand at that point. And they called it their Duo Symphonic series, and there's a zillion of those. And you can find all this stuff in various places in the internet. And that's probably not the only ones that are there, but you have to kind of dig to find them because people don't know because there's no marking on the set that says it's a Wells Gardner CG or C. And whether they recognize it's got a WG24 on it or not is unlikely as well. So there could be many, many different manufacturers that also sold this radio. And the same is true for Tom's radio. I just couldn't find another example of it. Let me give you some of the places I got stuff. This book is, like I said, this is a gold mine, and it's about 10 pages of wonderful stuff. And that's actually the cover page because the book hardbound doesn't say a whole lot on it. Turns out Alfred Gherardi was a guy that provided a lot of really good radio information back in the day. So make sure you take a look at his books when you see them. Then we get to just radiomuseum.org, and I assume most of you have been there. You can search all kinds of stuff, and enough said. That's all about radios. World Radio History is the paper version of radiomuseum.org, and so we're going to talk about this Gernsback Radio Service Manual, which is a predecessor to Riders and overlapped Riders for a while. And from what I can tell, Hugo Gernsback and John Ryder were good chums, and I think Hugo just backed off and let John take over. And the quality of at least the paper, if nothing else, that Ryder used is a lot better. I mean, Gernsback used something near newsprint. The stuff is really brittle. But the good news is most of it is scanned into World Radio History. So if you can't find a radio in Riders, you might find it in Gernsback. And I've had a few instances of that. The other thing is Tom's lookup for the Mallory Yackley, which is this line right here in this free radio lookup. That's these three orange books here. There's various versions of them. They're using versions 3 and 5. I happen to have 1st, 4th, and 6th laying around here. But Mallory printed a bunch of stuff. Even though this is an excellent book, it has none of this radio data in it. It's more of a tutorial or a theory of operation kind of book. But these things were put together to sell you Mallory potentiometers. And that's really what they're in there for. You look up the model of the radio, it tells you what the volume control part number is, the tone control part number, and so on. But also at the end of that line is the tube lineup. And that's what this thing searches. So instead of manually thumbing through these books, as much as we all might love to do that, this is pretty quick. And as you can see, they also offer other databases to search. I didn't dig into it, but there is a link here, and there's a link to all these major things, as I mentioned in the chat. So Plant A, we're finally there. Notice Plant A was in Chicago. Got to remember, Chicago was the Silicon Valley of the 30s. Most of the radio companies were in Chicago. So here we are in the Gherardi book. And let me just blow this up for you. There you are. Plant A on license tag, Clinton Manufacturing Company, 1217 West Washington Boulevard, Chicago. Clinton became a brand name of another company. I didn't want to go down that mouse hole right now, but Plant A was the major thing everybody was wondering what it is. So if you look up Clinton radios in Riders, believe it or not, they show up. So now you can get schematics. Yay. So here's a partial list of markings of various brand radios. And we did the WG24 already. Here's a Montgomery Ward radio. It says BRC here. That's Belmont Radio Corporation. And so again, Warwick we talked about earlier, and Corona. So sometimes the number is on the serial number tag and sometimes it's on the license tag. Now, keep in mind, this particular example has a B here on the serial number tag. Whoops, sorry. I have no idea what the B stands for. I mean, this is got a lot of tentacles to it. I was just trying to get to, the basic premise of the whole situation. So, and as you can see by the slide I got to too quickly, that's it. I guess we're ready for questions.
Well, that's fantastic, Tom, because I just happened to picked up a Corona brand radio exactly like the one that Tom has the same dial on it. And
Wow.
Let's see if I can. Probably can't see, everybody else probably can't see it because we're still sharing the screen, but there we go.
Okay.
Whoop, there we go. Windows glaring.
Oh,
But
that's a weird looking one. Does that have an eye tube? I
it
can't.
does, right at the 12 o'clock position.
Okay.
If I can get any better, but anyway, it did say C on the tag on the back of it. Here's a close-up of the dial.
Yep, that's the same one.
Yeah. And mine was missing a tag, so I didn't know what brand it was. And so I went on the Antique Radio forum. Here's a close-up of the tag. I don't know if that will show up on there or not, but that's it says C on it. That's how we determined it was a Corona.
Hmm.
And someone was kind enough to take a Corona tag off of their radio and take a picture of it so I can put it back on the front, because they spotted below the dial, there's two little pinholes right on the bottom side of the dial here where the tag would have went.
Oh, yeah.
So, sorry for not being able to share the pictures. I'm on a tablet and these are on my phone. So, but I was in the same boat, so that was kind of fascinating to see that you have a very similar radio, same chassis. Probably, I think it is
Yeah.
a 210 that they found was a schematic for it.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Just
Well,
different.
Tom, that
chassis.
was a great presentation. Thanks very much for.
Tom, this is Keith. Was there a plant B and a plant C or anything like that?
There was, and one of the things I thought I had in there, but I guess I took it out, but it's in the print version. Jeff Pollack had been collecting a list of companies, and he had a very comprehensive list, but there weren't any references as to where the information came from. And in his list, Plant B and Plant C are also the same company, but I don't have a way to validate that. So, except that obviously he's got a credible guy, and I'm sure he's not, telling me anything improper, but we just don't have a documented source to back it up.
So it was basically the same physical address.
Don't know. They could have had more physical addresses with Plant B and Plant C. You don't know. So I don't know what I don't know is a problem right now. So I didn't bring that up because I can't validate it with a documented source from the period at this point.
Okay, just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, excellent.
This was a great talk.
Go ahead.
Thank you. How soon are you can you share this? Can you share the slides from this? Because I have a couple of radios I can't figure out. I'd love to try.
Well, I can, Jeff, I'll just give you a link to them, and you can just, because I can't email them because the pictures are 12 gazillion megabytes. But
Yeah.
and they're also, most of that's going to be written up in the club newsletter, which is going to come out in about a week. So I'm happy to send it.
I am almost always able to find anything in Radio Museum, but I got one or two that I've got one right now I cannot figure out, and I've looked at everything on the internet. At least I thought I love that one site you had where you say you just give the tube line up and it gives you possibilities. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, you got to thank Tom Zaczek for that one. I wasn't aware of that because I used to go manually through books and look at tube lineups and spend, hours. The other thing is I'm happy to help you out on that if you want to, share some pictures and stuff, because maybe between the two of us we can figure it out. I really
That'd be
enjoy
great.
figuring that out.
I'll
fun.
do that. I'll send you stuff. You can send it out to the guys. Maybe you guys could help me figure it out, because I want to get a schematic for the radio, and I can't. I don't know where to go. So
Okay,
right, great talk. Thank you.
thank you.
So you said that was a grillcloth.com where you can find that.
Yeah, if you look in the chat, I already put the links to those in there.
Okay.
So if you save the chat, you guys will have all the primary links. You won't have all the detailed links of the club aluminum and all that, because that's important for a specific radio. But the 3 or 4 main ones are in there, along with the title of the Girardi book, because at one point the Girardi book was online, but I haven't been able to find it. So right now we have to live with the world of physical copies. I think whoever the publisher was then is still owned by somebody. So is my guess.
Hey guys, have you recall this book, The Locator?
No, none.
Gerald Larson, some 25, 30 years ago, from Elmwood Park, Illinois, went through all of Riders and created an index by tube lineup. Start with the amplifier, the rectifier, and
What's the author's name?
Gerald Lawson, and I got my copy from his wife, so I don't know if she's still alive.
Is he a G Gerald or a J Gerald?
G.
Yeah, I have that book. I bought at a swap meet years ago.
And that's helped me, especially when there wasn't internet information available in the older days.
Yeah, I've also got a book published by, one of the major ones, where I think it was RCA published it, which has two lineups in it from the 30s, but it's heavily biased to RCA. And when you want to try and find something else, it generally isn't in there. It's a little thing about the size of a tube manual, of the early tube manuals.
Bill Goodwin, would you mind putting that Larson book in the chat?
Okay.
Thank you. All right, Tom. Well, that was an awesome presentation that really covered a lot of info, and I think that's very valuable stuff for our collectors. So thanks again for pulling all that together, and we'll move on to the next and final presentation of the day from Larry Snyder. Larry is a member of the Colorado Club as well as ARCI, and he's done a few presentations for us already. And today's is called Reproducing a Reproducer. You didn't work at the Department of Redundancy Department, did you? No? That's supposed to be a joke, but.
That should do it, huh?
Yeah, so without further ado, Larry, why don't you
Okay,
take it away.
I'll try sharing the screen. So
Perfect.
what I'm going to talk about is Atwater Kent radio, which I picked up at the for $1 at the CRC meeting. And at this point in time, when I picked up the radio, I knew nothing about speakers or what was inside them. So this presentation will be unlike most presentations, I would think, because I will walk you through the stages of my thought processes and my concerns at that stage and why I did some things. The photos I show you will be with parts and concepts that were not finished at the time. So with that said, I'll get into it. Atwater Kent started, of course, making his open frame radios, and he made photographs and other things of that nature. And this article on the left from the Literary Digest shows the Model L speaker. And that whole article on the left is more or less, I think he's telling his dealers how he's going to advertise in the upcoming year. If I read all that, that's an interesting piece. The one in the middle is his 1926 dealer bulletin, which shows the Model L for $17. And the advertisement on the right is from 1927. Advertising the Model L down on the lower left-hand corner. And that one was sold for $16. So that's a little background on the radios. Prior to 1925, his radios required earphones to listen to. And if more than one person wanted to hear that, you had to take the earphone off and give it to somebody else, and you couldn't really share what was being broadcast. Now, Atwater Kent had made phonographs at that time, and the phonographs had speakers. So it was kind of a natural evolution of speakers that he would make them for his radio line. So the early models marketed in 1925 were the L&M speakers. The Model L speaker is the less expensive version of its big brother, the Model M. And it is the only one to have the reproducer made of pot metal as one of its distinctions. And I believe it is the only speaker where the horn of the speaker fits around the output of the reproducer and not inside it. And I'll have some drawings of that coming up. As most of you know, pot metal is a thing we don't want to see in radios. Typically, it deteriorates very rapidly. To me, it looks like it's got heat check markings on it. It distorts, it cracks, it bends. Depending on the mixture of the elements that are thrown in the pot, you don't know what you're going to get because the proportions of the mix were not well controlled. My dad worked in the die-cast industry in the 1950s, and he cursed pot metal. And the problem was that they would make parts with the pot metal, ship them out to their customers, only to have them being returned weeks later with the customer's complaint they're out of tolerance or they're cracked, or things of that nature. This is a series of photographs of parts from a 1927 Crosley radio that I worked on. The photograph at the left is a tuning condenser where the blades have splayed apart. And you can see a large crack running up through the condenser plates. The middle photograph at the top shows the rotor portions of the tuning condenser. The one on the left is distorted, but notice the one on the right, not so much in the distortion. So while pot metal was an equal opportunity defect among radio suppliers, it didn't necessarily mean all the parts in the radio were defective. For example, on the extreme right, we see the tuning shaft support being broke apart by whatever pot metal does. But in the upper right, it's more or less unscathed. It's more or less a perfect undeformed support. I show some distorted pulleys. In this photograph, that's the pinion shaft support, which I had to make a new one down in the lower left-hand corner. And I also had to make new tuning shaft supports as shown in the middle bottom photograph. And basically getting my measurements off the undamaged support. Now, I want to go somewhere with the terminology because it might get confusing. There's an output housing in the original device and an output cap. And I'm going to bring up a drawing of those shortly. Those two units are screwed together with other parts. And when they're put together, they're referred to as the reproducer because it reproduces what's on the plate of the output tube. When the reproducer is assembled, the horn and the bell, it becomes a speaker. This is a photograph of the speaker I have. The reproducer housing is this device here, which is bolted to the base and supports the horn and the bell of the tube of the speaker. The horn is fitting over a tube which sticks out of the reproducer housing. The horn and the bell are free to swivel around this point. This is a list of some important specifications of the Model L. In case you find one that is not identified, I've listed some things you can readily measure. And you can read these here. The bell is 14, the base is 8.5 inches in diameter, etc. And the overall height is 19 inches because it brought a lot of these horn speakers look similar, but they're different in size. This is a drawing I made of the original Model L reproducer as I found it. It, of course, has the two plus or minus inputs, feeding some magnetic coils. This is the output pipe, which carries the horn, and the horn can swivel around it. The output cap, which is pot metal, screws into the output housing. And that was an adjustment by pushing on the spring. It brought the magnet coils closer or further away from the diaphragm. When I received this speaker, this was all damaged parts, and that'll come up, I'll show you later. But this ring was broken off here. The neck was broken off across here. These are the parts that I started with. There were too many parts, and I was a bit confused because it had 2 diaphragm plates. It had 4 coils. So obviously these parts did not all come from the same speaker. And what I received was, well, what I received in the cardboard box was leftover parts that somebody else had. This is a photograph of the broken output housing, the output cap. There's a grip ring around here that has pieces missing. It was kind of like the top of a mason jar, like a grip ring. There's a close-up of the parts. This is where the output pipe broke off, the broken grip ring. Interestingly, on the underside of the output housing shows a crack that runs completely through this up the other side. Only in this very thick section is this whole housing being held together. These black areas in here are merely shadows from my illuminating light. I tried to reassemble all the parts I had because I was still unfamiliar with how this all went together. So I put together 2 of the coils and screwed them in. This is the output cap sitting on the output housing. These 2 pieces of threaded rings, I finally deduced they came off of this housing here. So I was still trying to find out how the reproducer failed. Of course, the obvious selection would have been because of the pot metal, but I concluded that the output pipe and the mounting tab broke off because the speaker was dropped, or at least roughly handled, and not entirely because of the pot metal. The reason is there's no bending force on the output pipe when the speaker is used because the weight of the horn and the bell act directly over the output pipe. In fact, this is one of my housings I made. It's standing on my desk, not bolted down. And then that was an aha moment. I took it out of the housing and I could stand the horn and the bell up directly on the desk, and it would be perfectly balanced. And why did I care? Well, it's because I was considering what to make a new housing out of and how strong it had to be. And if I was going to make one, should I make the tabs bigger and that type of thing? That's why I was concerned over this. So I was thinking, how am I going to make this repair? Parts are no longer available from Atwater, Kent. If I found some or waited for some or got them from the internet, they'd probably be the same as what I had. So I was thinking, all I wanted to do was to make this speaker stand on a shelf and play so I could use it with my other Atwater Kent speakers. how could I arrange to do that? I realized it would not be a perfect repair, but most of the parts would be under the base, so to speak, and out of sight. And it might look like a speaker again. So I made a drawing of my plan of how I was going to repair this. On the left is the original reproducer from all the parts I measured. And on the right is one of the variations I was looking to perform, where I would use a modern reproducer and make a housing to house it. What I used for the replacement reproducer was an earpiece from a headset. This is a 2000 ohm reproducer, and I think this was made by Tandy or Radio Shack. I don't know, the has no identification markings on the one I used. So what I made the original housing on was a Trex. I made it from the parts, corner posts of my deck. And I like Trex. It's got a lot of advantages. I could stain it. Trex is no longer available in the sizes needed for this part, but you could do it by 3D printing. And I made a 3D model of it, and it's shown on the right here, which if anybody wants, I can make it available in STL format, which is suitable for printing. I made two versions of the output housing, 1 and 2, because I didn't like my version 1, and I was concerned about its strength, where version 2 is a one-piece unit. This is version 1, 2 pieces. The oak, I made the pipe out of oak on the left, and it's glued into the housing on the right, which was Trex. If you're putting in a different reproducer from different earphones, you'd have to make sure you make this cavity and its associated retaining holes suitable for your speaker. This is housing 2, the one-piece design. At this stage, I still didn't carve down the mounting tabs because I was still concerned about bending of these tabs in use. So I kept the tabs with all this surface area that would have to break, as opposed to the normal rectangular tab. There's a picture of me machining the housing 1 from the block. Trex machines easily. This is housing 1 with the output pipe. I messed up on one of the diameters here and used some wood filler on it. At this stage, I haven't put the flats on across to start forming the tabs. I haven't put the radiuses on it. This was an intermediate photograph along the way. This shows the reproducer in the new housing inside the base, bolted to the base, and the housing without the reproducer in it. This is the one-piece housing before the holes get tapped and cleaned out and chamfered. These are retaining holes that will hold the housing in place. And the first one, I made this bore slightly too big, and this housing reproducer would fall out. So that initiated making the 2 retaining holes. See here. It's the evolution of the process of what I was doing. So lining them up, we have the original 2-piece housing, 1-piece housing. This better shows the crack down here running through. There's very little holding this piece together. And the underside views here. Well, this is the finished housing 1 with the oak output pipe. Horn is sitting around the pipe. And we see a name tag here. The name game. The original name tag was missing from the bell. And since I was throwing away the pot metal cap that held the identity of the speaker on it, nobody would be able to identify the speaker. So off the internet, I got what the name tag looked like. I printed out some name tags on clear sticky back and glued them on a 8,000 thick brass sheet. And when I stuck them in the holes, it looks like this. It's not exact, but somebody in the future will be able to identify the speaker. And that's it. I used references from, this is a very helpful source, Atwater Kent, the manufacturer and his radios. That's available online. And the other two references were my papers and the Colorado Radio Club's flash. And lots of searches on pop metal and on the internet, which I found did not have much, maybe only 2 or 3 sources. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry. That was great how you restored that speaker. Most people would just give up when they had something like that, but you're very tenacious and detailed, and I really appreciate the effort you went through to do that and present it to us. So thanks very much. And I particularly like the personal story that your dad actually worked in a shop where they cast pot metal. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, he had other comments I couldn't repeat. I learned some new words from him and pot metal in combination with pot metal. So
That's great. Any questions for Larry, or if you want a copy of his 3D file, just so you can go 3D print one of these?
I'd just like to make a comment. This is Tom. Inherently, there's nothing wrong with pot metal. The problem was with the metallurgy. There's many things that are die cast that are made of pot metal, and that's the only way back when you can make a complicated item. And if you paid attention to the metallurgy, they last forever. If you look at hood ornaments on a lot of 1930s cars, they're chrome plated pot metal, and they're still perfect because Ford and GM and those guys made a point of controlling the metallurgy. And the two things that kill pot metal is chemistry, is the main deal. And lead getting into the mix causes a slow chemical reaction, as well as humidity. Those two things, depending on what the underlying metal is what causes them to slowly blow apart. So, end of commercial.
yeah, so you're saying the proportions of the mix are the problem?
The proportion of the mix and if there's any lead in there at all, you've got a time bomb.
Yeah.
And most of these places that cast pot metal also cast lead for various things, and they didn't control their process, and they also didn't necessarily know any better. But you'll find there's die cast things out in the world which we refer to as pot metal that are still perfect, that are 100 years old.
Oh yeah, that's well known.
Yeah, we don't complain about those because they didn't fall apart. We complain about the ones that fall apart, and the ones that fall apart tend to be all the same ones because they're all made by the same company.
It's interesting you mentioned that water can contribute to that, because one of Dad's complaints were that the workers in the shop would use the piles of ingredients that went in the pot as their bathroom. So that might be a source of moisture.
Yeah.
I have a question. Using the smaller headphone drivers, was it as powerful as the older Atwater speaker drivers?
I can't answer that because I have nothing to compare it to, because I don't have any other horn speakers to compare it to. Okay. But it certainly put out a loud volume. To me, it was a loudspeaker as advertised.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Larry, for that great presentation. And just to keep things moving along, because we've got about 30 minutes left on the clock here, we will be next moving to our show and tells. And at this time, I always like to put a request out for people to join us and be a presenter at some point in the future. And so Matt's putting up a poll here, and I know you guys have got a lot of great information stored away up in your brain and down in your basement or wherever you keep your radios. And please consider being a presenter. And if you have no experience doing that, Matt and I can certainly walk you through the process, and you can share your ideas and presentations with us. So please consider it. And with that being said, we'll move on to the show and tell section. I know we have at least 4 of them today, so please be mindful of the clock here and try to keep it down to like 3 minutes or 4 minutes when you do it. So whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Thomas, Marty Linke.
Hey, Marty.
Good morning. How is everybody? Great presentations this morning. Again, very good. All right, I've got 6 or 7 items here. I'm just going to flash them up on the screen. I'm going to go quick and I'll stay in your time constraints. Look at what I found. I have my very first Zenith Royal 275. Found this at a antique store. Very cool. It's a great performing radio. I'm looking for the logo, and I need a volume control. I took it apart, tried to fix it, but it's too far gone. So that's that one. I picked up this GE transistor at the Shelby Hamfest about over Labor Day weekend. Had to recap it. It looks great, and I've seen these on eBay for selling for about $150. But you know what? It's a crappy radio. It doesn't work very well. So what are you gonna do? All right. Here's a really interesting item. I picked this up yesterday at a resale shop. It's an ICO decade box, resistors and capacitors. But what's unique about it is you can do series RC and parallel RC. So it's a test feature I've never seen anyplace. So I picked that up for $20. I don't exactly know what I'm going to do with it. I tested the caps. They're in great shape, but every single resistor in here is just not anywhere close to being in spec. So this is going to be one of those 10 below zero night restorations. I have to replace all the resistors in it. There's that one. I found another very cool little instrument made by Simpson. It's a capacitor tester. It actually gives you the value of a capacitor you might be testing, or if you don't know what the value is. And it uses one 12AU7 tube, and it is amazingly accurate. It's a very cool device. So I got that on the bench now. I made a 4, 8, and 16 ohm dummy box. You know, when you're doing IF alignments, you know, nobody wants to listen to that 1,000 hertz tone. So I made a dummy box so I don't have to listen to it. And then another great find. Oh, this is a AC voltmeter. Hope you can see that. And this, in conjunction with my dummy box, this is a fantastic meter for IF alignment. It's very, very sensitive, and you can turn the volumes way down and really, really tweak the IF cans. All right, and then the final piece is a battery operated signal chaser. It's made by a company called BD Kits. And I put the link to the company up in the chat room. But this is a battery operated deal. And this is what she looks like on the inside. It's really a cool little device, because when you're working with the AE5s, it totally isolates you from the line, so you don't have to worry about shorting yourself out or getting extra hum, or so it's completely isolated because it's battery operated. And this is the probe. The kit comes with a printed circuit board, and this case used to hold M&M candies. It's a candy holder. So we're busy here. I've been spending some time with transistor radios lately, but I have a new old AE5 on the bench right now. So I'm getting back to tubes. All right, that's my show and tell.
Well, thanks, Marty. You sure collected a lot of stuff in a short period of time. That's
Yeah, it's getting a little worried about that.
Follow you around and figure out where you're going.
I got to find out what to do with all this stuff. Yeah, I did have an interesting thing happen to me. I had a friend who was very ill last year, almost on his deathbed. He's much better now and he's back at work, thank God. But I ended up giving him one of my restored radios. And I'll tell you, I wasn't expecting his reaction. He was gushing about having an old tube radio. I painted it his favorite color. And he's just loving it. And he's listening to one of the WYLL, the religious station on 1160. His parents used to listen to that station when he was a boy, and he remembers that. So I'm thinking I might get into the giveaway business here pretty soon, just to make some room here. These people really love these radios. You wouldn't expect it, but they just gush over them. It's very, very cool.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thanks for the show and tell and the touching human story. That's always a good thing. So thanks, Marty. So who has the next show and tell?
I'll go next. Let me grab something.
Okay, Bill.
And now the moment we've been awaiting for.
Well,
yeah.
I picked up something about a week and a half ago. For those of you who are familiar, obviously you've all seen transoceanic radios. And many of you know I worked for Zenith for 20 years. And I never saw this particular radio. This was their cheaper version of a transoceanic in the late 60s. And actually it's built in Chicago. It doesn't have the band spread dials that the transoceanic has, but this is AM, FM, shortwave. And an homage, I think, to the last of their germanium transistor radios. And if it's of interest, because I said I teased at the beginning of this presentation, beginning of the when we logged on, that I bought a second one 15 minutes before this started off eBay, because this one has a broken antenna and the one I bought on eBay has a good antenna. So between the two of them, I should be able to make one that works. And I figured I needed to move this up about 4 or 5 decades from what we were talking about most of today, although I found it all really very interesting. Certainly we do all love our vacuum tube radios, but germanium powered radios are probably most obscure as well. So somewhere down the line, I'll probably document how we make this radio work. So that's my show and tell.
Bill, is that a printed circuit board radio or is that a metal chassis radio?
It's actually, that's a very interesting question. It's actually both. It has a metal chassis for the front end, but there's a big chunk of it that's got a printed circuit board in it, which is interesting. So about half of it's plug-in transistors and half of it's not. I have not made this one work yet because I just got it, but it runs on a pile of D cells, just like the transoceanics did. It runs on 12 volts worth of D cells, so it's pretty heavy. And it shares a lot of, if you look at the circuitry, it shares a lot of the design factors, because obviously the guys in the radio group at Zenith, it was the same guys doing both radio, all the radios. So they would obviously share what they already had designed. But this is probably a cost reduction to the D7000 that most of you have seen before. And this was supposedly the cheaper one if you couldn't afford a D7000. But in my true world here, I don't have room for consoles anymore, as Tom already knows. But transistor radios are smaller and easier to kind of pack around. And they don't weigh as much. Oh, this one weighs plenty.
Thanks, Bill.
How's it on performance? Is it
I couldn't tell you. I haven't made it work yet. My guess is it'll perform very much like a transoceanic. It shares a lot of the front end circuitry.
Okay, last time I saw one of those, there was a Zayers store in Miami, and I was about 13 or 14 at the time. and they were brand new. And I said, holy gosh, can I have one of those for you and I built for Hanukkah or what have you? And instead I got a Lloyd's radio. So what
I think this is probably better than the Lloyd's.
Of course it is. Of course. I just dealt with that, knowing that.
It has one very unique feature. You know, there's a band selector switches on the front, and it's got a right angle gear to get to the switch. And right now, this one, they're not mating properly and it needs to be taken apart. It's all there. I can see where it'll go back together. I had never seen them do anything that strange before, but it's one of the weird factors of this.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great, Bill. We look forward to seeing you next time with a repaired radio to show us.
Yes.
So appreciate that. We're running short on time, so let's move on to the next show and tell. Who's got one?
I've got one here.
Okay.
It's the 100th anniversary of Briggs and Stratton Radio. This is their catalog from 1922, December 1922.
Wow.
Here's the one of the earphones, the 2000 ohm. They made 2000 ohm and 3000 ohm earphones. There's a little radio frequency transformer that they made. The ones that Globe Electric from Milwaukee made look very similar because they were made in the same building. And then here's the box set of earphones. All of their original stuff came in these orange and black packages. That was their marketing ploy. And here's an example of their crystal radio.
Is that overhead valve?
Documented that on the Zoom here a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it's documented in the Wisconsin Antique Radio Club. This is a 2013 July issue. So happy birthday to Briggs and Stratton Radios. So,
yeah, I think we're going to nickname you Mr. Briggs and Stratton, Dale. I think you've done an admirable job in collecting all that stuff and telling us about it and documenting it for future generations. So,
and if you've got a key with a diamond logo on it, that's the early Briggs and Stratton diamond. Their logo changed many times over the years, but all the early stuff has the open diamond logo.
that's great.
Okay, I'll go mute.
Thanks, Dale. That's good. We're looking forward to your next full-length presentation, by the way. So start working on it, please. Thank you. Who's got another one?
I have 3 slides I can show.
Okay, Robert.
So let me get to and so I've got a persistent friend who asked me to make a miniature hinge for a Wireless Specialty Apparatus Company cabinet. And I've never made anything like that in my shop. And I can't punch a line of precision rectangular holes. So how to get it done? Well, I found a local shop that does precision water jet cutting. I didn't know that they could do anything like that on this scale, but I made up a drawing using AutoCAD, and a few days later had strips of precision placed beautiful rectangles, like you see in the lower left. I folded and formed hinge eyes with no proper tooling at all. And it took 8 hours or more for me to bash this hinge into something that looked pretty decent. And but then he says, that's nice, but it needs to be nickel plated. And I can't, I've plated many things, but nothing that's 8 1/4 inches long. So my old nickel plate setup had held only about 500 milliliters of of a solution. And this, I needed 2,000 or 2 liters. And so here was my solution. I went to the local Walmart and found a plastic storage container. And I had a zinc plating kit that I bought years ago, but never used. And it has a thermostatic controller for an immersion type 300 watt quartz heater element. It heats to the required 110 degrees Fahrenheit just fine, but the solution in a tall container like this became much too stratified in temperature. So I went to eBay and I found out that you could get small magnetic stirrers without heat capability. And there was one here that was $30. And that's like the next cheapest thing was $80. So I knew I was going to get a piece of crap, but I bought it anyway. So this magnetic stirrer, I modified my base and all that so I could put the stirrer in there, and it heated up the water just fine, or my test water. And one of the things that has me a little scared is that this is a nickel anode right here, and you notice the little bubbles that are clinging to it, and this spinning stirrer in here, magnetic stirrer, is I was hoping that it would knock the bubbles off of there. So I don't know if that's going to be a problem when I get to actually trying to put my plating solution in and plate that hinge. So I did this yesterday, so you're going to have to ask me next time if I was able to plate that damn hinge. And but ask me in several months or whenever we meet again. So I'm done here.
You've got us hanging on the edge of our seats, Robert, and so everybody needs to tune in January to find out. Just out of curiosity, what did you pay? What did you pay for that hinge? That jet, water jet.
The persistent friend is the one that picked up the tab for that.
Oh, okay.
And I think he got about 10 blanks for $100 done. But I was really surprised that a little 1/4-inch square cutout like that could be water jetted with better than 5/1000ths of an inch precision. So I was impressed.
Okay. Well, thank you, Robert. And we've certainly had a great set of show and tells and presentations today, and we've used up almost all the time. There's like 8 minutes on the clock. And so I'll just say thanks to everyone for participating. And, this concludes the presentation part of our program today. So thanks very much, everyone.